got questions, he always has an answer. It's Sean Hannity, this afternoon at 2, right before Joe Walsh at 5 on AM 560. The Answer.
Dan and Amy, so all the stars were out in D.C. until they had to observe Earth Hour later that evening. This to recite the left's talking points about gun confiscation. And the big star, the biggest of the big stars, is not one of the Hollywood celebs. It's this kid from Parkland named David Hogg, who had this to say to you old fuddy-duddies who aren't getting gun control done.
The cold grasp of corruption shackles the District of Columbia. The winter is over. Change is here. The sun shines on a new day, and the day is ours. For the first-time voters show up 18% of the time at midterm elections. Not anymore. Now, who here is going to vote in the 2018 election? If you listen real close, you can hear the people in power shaking. They've gotten used to being protective of their position, chewing the safety of inaction. Inaction is no longer safe, and to that we say, no more.
Yeah.
Who's scared?
Yeah, budding Chuck Schumer there on the dais. Now, others, though, that get given less profile, Kyle Keshev, who also is a Parkland survivor, who is only allowed to appear on Fox News. He had this to say about his classmate and the march on Saturday.
I was at the march itself, and I saw this extremely anti-GOP. One of the most biggest causes of this entire march is being anti-Republican, and we've seen that in the marches itself. A lot of the things that David Hogg has said are egregious and inflammatory. I don't think that the NRA has that much evil power that it's been putting on politicians. I don't. It's led by 5.5 million people who back it. And I really don't think that what David Hogg is saying right now is true. And I don't think what he's doing is positive for the American people. I think if he truly cared about the American people, he would sit down and he would talk to legislators and he would get all aspects of the discussion, and then he would act. Because what we see here, guns aren't the issue. Okay? It's everything surrounding acquiring a weapon.
John Hinraker in Powerline had an interesting comment about Hogg. He said, he reminds me of Cindy Sheehan, i.e. he'll have absolute moral authority until he becomes a liability to the Democratic Party, at which point he'll never be heard of again.
Oh. Yeah. Well, they gave him a number of platforms. I mean, Good Morning America, you have to hear what he said. This is about the Maryland shooter. He wants to, take people's guns away, but the Maryland shooter was stopped because there was an armed security guard.
I had to relive a lot of the previous memories that I had from my school shooting. Everybody takes grief their own way, but for me it was more infuriating realizing that because that was a person with a gun, and in reality, were they taken out by law enforcement? Yes, and I'm so glad that they were. But they shouldn't have had to do that in the first place. It's due to a lack of in-training, a mental health care problem, a gun control problem, and an American problem is what we have here.
All right, now it's like reciting talking points,
well,
canned answers.
Well, he's a leftist automaton, and that's exactly what the left wants him to be. For more on this topic and others, we're pleased to be joined by Steve Cortes, CNN political commentator and former head of President Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council. Steve, thanks for being with us.
You bet. Thanks for having me. And an NRA member, by the way.
Oh, and an NRA member. All right.
Evil. So, should we have him on the show?
Yeah, blood on your hands.
Yeah.
All right, so your reviews on the march and the energy that the left is putting into these kids to keep the energy up for the midterms.
Right. Well, first let me say, of course I respect their First Amendment right to protest. It's incredibly important to the American experiment. I would also say that there won't be a First Amendment if there's not a Second Amendment. I really believe, as the NRA often says, that it's the right that protects all other rights and it's not about hunting. It's about self-defense, and that can be self-defense against a criminal, against an invader, against a tyrant, against anyone who would try to steal our liberty. And one of those precious liberties is freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to convene and protest. So all of those are protected by an armed citizenry. Thank goodness our founding fathers knew that. And this young man, I think, unfortunately, though, takes that right of free speech and uses it to constantly preach to us and to talk down to us and tell us that we're to blame, gun-owning Americans, NRA members. We're to blame for that awful tragedy that happened in Parkland, instead of A, the shooter, and B, law enforcement, which failed at every single level in this awful case. And for the life of me, I don't know how Sheriff Israel still has a job, that he hasn't been forced by public pressure to resign. The number of times that they fumbled on this case where they clearly could have intervened and at least made it difficult, if not impossible.
And the Broward County Sheriff, and the Broward County Sheriff's Office tweeted out support for the Parkland students at the march. Nobody tweeted out support for Kyle Kashoff, who was a survivor of Parkland either, too. So it just speaks again to this is about moving a political agenda. Can we just be honest about it? The evidence is overwhelming.
And then some at the march.
And Kyle, sorry.
Well, some at the march wore price tags. They took the money that Senator Rubio received from the NRA and divided it by all the millions of young people in Florida. And everyone had a price tag that said $1.05. I mean, clearly they're trying to vilify the NRA. Weapons confiscations, but do you think that this movement's going to produce any real change?
Well, I sure hope not. And I don't think so, really. I do think that Americans generally are very reasonable on guns. And, regarding a couple issues there, I'm glad you brought that up, Amy. Number one is that Rubio, bent over backwards to try to be as reasonable as he could. He, I think, very bravely went to that CNN town hall, which was as hostile an environment as a pro-gun Republican could face. So I respect him for doing it. But at the same time, I guess I'd also point out to him and to others is that they're not interested in being reasonable. That's not what it's about. It's about political theater. And they vilify him even more than people who didn't go, which I think just shows that this isn't about logic. It's not about our rights. It's about their agenda. And if you don't conform, you're evil and you're bloody, literally. And to the point of money too, and I'm glad you brought that up because it's really absurd. The NRA's power, despite what they said at that march, the NRA's power does not emanate from its supposedly giant cache of money. NRA total spending in politics is a drop in the bucket compared to total spending in politics. People like the unions, like Big Pharma, even individuals like the Koch brothers or Tom Steyer. I mean, the NRA's spending doesn't even come close to that level of spending. But it is powerful. Why? Because of millions of law-abiding, gun-carrying Americans who believe in liberty because of a tradition in this country of armed citizens. And that's where the power of the NRA comes from, not from this supposedly massive war chest, financial war chest.
I learned this yesterday, so you want to get your reaction to it, about this young woman who considered becoming a journalist, who likes to ride horses, care for her 7-year-old daughter.
Late night sushi and walks along the beach?
Yeah, this fascinating hagiographic review of Stormy Daniels in New York Times before she appeared on 60 Minutes yesterday. I mean, it's the great prostitute with a heart of gold story, Steve. I mean, who couldn't fall in love with this?
Right. Well, look, I still think this is such a diversion tactic of the opponents of President Trump and of left-leaning media. And look, I'll be the first to admit it's got all the ingredients, right, for a good, tawdry, salacious story. So, I mean, I get the attention, I do. But in terms of actual relevance today, what Donald Trump did or didn't do in the boudoir 12 years ago with a porn star, to me, is of zero relevance today to what he's doing as president. And on top of that, as you say, it's fascinating that the accusers of Bill Clinton, were relegated to bimbo status by the media immediately, discredited, disparaged. And look at the difference now. Now we have someone who makes porn for a living, somebody who has repeatedly contradicted herself, and within recent weeks, by the way, not even, going way, way back. I mean, has repeatedly contradicted herself on the record. And yet she's being held out as a saint and a victim. And, I would also point this out. The idea that she's a victim, if her story's true, and I have no idea if it is, and I don't frankly care, but if it is, she had consensual sex.
Well, but she's rejected the idea she's a victim. She's not even saying that.
She's not a Me Too movement. But
well, okay, but that theme is very prevalent in mainstream media, that she's been bullied, right?
Well, they tried to connect her to the Me Too movement, and she was threatened, she claims, in the parking lot of her gym when she wanted to try and sell her story. But do you honestly believe that President Trump didn't have an affair with her 10 years ago?
Look, I have no idea. But again, I don't care about the relevance. I just don't. I think that President Trump, everyone, myself included, everyone knew that President Trump has had a very colorful life, right? A Hollywood mogul, in many ways, TV star, married 3 times. Clearly, women and money were big themes of his life for a long time. I think two things are important to me. Number one, I think he's changed. I truly do. I think the process of running, the people he's surrounded himself, people like Mike Pence, I think he's a very different man. I think he's a prayerful man now, which he certainly was not before. And I'm not saying he's Mother Teresa at all, but I'm saying he's a different guy, number one. But number two, these were known knowns. Nobody believed that we were voting for a pastor-in-chief or for, St. Francis of Assisi to take the Oval Office. So there's nothing, there was no con involved here, in other words, from Trump voters. I think that what we knew was we're getting an outsider, a businessman, an agitator, a disruptor, and clearly somebody who had, a very colorful past. So, well, honestly, I don't have any idea. To me, that's not about – it's almost not my business. That's between him and Melania. It has no relevance to public policy, to his performance as a politician.
Well, let's talk about that agitator and that disruptor and the guy who's going to drain the swamp. And you square that with signing that $1.3 trillion omnibus legislation on Friday that has obviously, by definition, no spending restraint, no Obamacare fixes, no border security, and nothing resembling draining the swamp.
Right. Dan, listen, I don't criticize the president often, but there's no way I can try to put lipstick on that pig. That bill was awful. He should have vetoed it. I think he really wrestled with it. I understand why he signed it because of the military, but I wish he hadn't, quite frankly. And the idea to me that we've got $500 million for Planned Parenthood coming out of a Republican Congress and a pro-life president, a really pro-life president, and yet we have a pittance for the wall, which was a foundational premise of his whole candidacy. To me, that's an outrage. Now, I do blame President Trump. I put more blame on Hill Republicans, though. And to me, McConnell, Ryan, the difference between them and Pelosi and Schumer is just a hair's difference. And I believe that the Republicans are going to lose the House, and perhaps badly in the fall. And quite frankly, after this bill, they deserve to.
Well, I mean, this is the problem. I mean, you're not only on the substance, but on the politics of it. It's almost like they want to lose the majorities because you see the energy on the other side. You saw it on display over the weekend in D.C., and all this is going to do is further depress GOP and conservative participation.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, look, I'm as ardent a Trump supporter as you can find, and I'm depressed about this, right? I mean, this is tough for me to take. So imagine a more marginal, Trump supporter or somebody leaning kind of Republican, or, the 2016 voters who came out of the woods. And there was a lot of them, a lot of first-time voters, people, well into the middle and older ages who had never voted, who were motivated by this 2016 movement. It's going to be really hard, in my view. I hope I'm wrong, but it's going to be really hard to motivate them in 2018 in a few months, just given what they just saw happen. And that was the swamp won this round. Now, again, I'm not giving up. It's a long battle. I think there's a lot more rounds to come, which I think the swamp will lose. But the swamp won this one, and it's dispiriting. There's no way, I don't mean to be a bummer on a Monday morning, but I don't know any other way to say it. All
right. He is Steve Cortes, CNN political commentator and former head of President Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council. Steve, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
You bet. Have a great week.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning.